I'd like to end our discussions of history in HIS 1112 by getting us past the Cold War, by getting us to the end of the Cold War. Ronald Reagan, by his proponents, has often been credited with defeating the Soviet Union and ending the Cold War, but the picture is a lot more complex than that. It's going to take historians quite a while to get enough perspective on the whole Cold War era to give us good, solid histories that aren't tainted by partisan politics. But until that time, let's do as best we can on discussing the actual end of the Cold War. We do know that it ended. We know kind of sort of how it ended. Who gets the credit, who gets the blame, may be a politically sensitive issue, but we'll see what we can do with it here. The Cold War ended in about 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. One of the issues that the Soviet Union faced was unsustainable spending. It ran out of places it could borrow money from. It couldn't inflate its currency. It had far too many problems in generating good economic livelihood. And it was sucking money out of its own economy left and right for a couple of major military reasons. One was, indeed, Reagan's military posture in the 1980s. Reagan spent military money on SDI and on building up conventional forces in a manner that the Soviet Union attempted to keep up with and yet was unable to do so. And you can probably sum up one of the most significant reasons that the Soviet Union collapsed in one word: Afghanistan. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in early 1980, in the campaign season of 1980, and it just simply got bogged down for a long, long war in Afghanistan that cost a tremendous amount of money. And so that kind of military spending, trying to keep up with Reagan's high-tech and conventional military spending, and then having to spend money on an unsuccessful war in Afghanistan, with all of its enemies arming proxy armies like the Mujahideen, which we armed. That stuff will turn around and bite you if you're not careful. Anyway, led to one of the reasons that the Soviet Union fell. The architect of the end of the Cold War is less Ronald Reagan and more the fellow that you see here pictured, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the general secretary of the Communist Party, which means the premier of the Soviet Union during the 1980s. He instituted social reforms, socio-political reforms in the Soviet Union in order to give the people the taste of democracy that they wanted. He began with glasnost, which is openness, and perestroika, which is economic liberalism, attempting to create a certain level of market reform and market liberalization in this closed Stalinist economy that had stalled out by the 1980s. He sought good relations with the United States. He wanted to go beyond mere détente, which was a stabilization of a state of not quite war. And he wanted to establish actually warm relations with the United States. He was willing to sign a strategic arms limitation treaty that in 1987 that allowed on-site verification, which the Soviets had never allowed before. And in 1988, Gorbachev repudiated long-standing Soviet policies that required its satellite countries to have communist governments. Let me say that again. In 1988, Gorbachev gave up on forcing satellite countries that had been taken over by the Soviet Union after World War II to have communist governments. This ultimately foreshadowed the collapse of the Soviet Union during the term of President George Bush. Pro-Soviet regimes repudiated, or people in countries that were outside of Russia itself repudiated the old communist regimes. In 1989, the Solidarity movement got rid of the pro-Soviet regime in Poland. In 1989, East Germany repudiated its communist regime, and this included the destruction of the Berlin Wall that Reagan had called for in 1987. Between 1989 and 1992, Yugoslavia, a communist country, disintegrated into its component parts, which is why we now talk about Serbia and Bosnia and Kosovo. Those were all components of a unified country under the strongman Tito, but they repudiated that arrangement between 1989 and 1992. In 1990, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Balkan countries north of Poland broke away from the Soviet Union. And in 1991, with the Soviet Union breaking up as it was, Gorbachev fended off a hardline Soviet communist coup and allowed the Soviet Union to break into its constituent parts. After defeating the coup, he resigned as premier and as general secretary of the Communist Party, and the countries of the Soviet Union broke into their constituent parts, thus ending the Cold War. Let's look at this on a map of the former Soviet Union. All of the identified countries were part of the Soviet bloc, one way or another. Excuse me. You can see from East Germany and Czechoslovakia, this area was all Eastern Europe, and you can see that it was part of the Soviet bloc. This was Yugoslavia, right down here. A nation made up of smaller nations, just like the Soviet Union was made up of smaller nations. You can see these countries right here were actually provinces of the Soviet Union. And they all fractured. When the Soviet Union fractured into its component parts, all of these countries withdrew, and leaving the Soviet Union no more. We used to talk about the Soviet Union as being Russia. Well, after 1991, the old Soviet Union, the only thing left of it was Russia. We'll see how this works out in the future. In the years since 1991, Russia has gone through tremendous turmoil, as have these other countries. Things seem to be stabilizing a little bit now, but we'll have to keep our eyes on this as historians concerned about how we tell these stories to our children and grandchildren. And with that, I thank you for your attention.